started. One of the things I really like about this place, so this was a really interesting day so far. So I had breakfast with our guest, David, this morning, and we talked a bit. But then we had a meeting talking about computational science and integrating it into our curriculum and so forth with our education group. And we walked, Randy and I walked over to the VPR's office, and we're talking about Zika virus and safe genes and this terraformer project we have and the zombie apocalypse and all of that. And now we're gonna hear from our guest, David Bunn. So, there we go. It's like, what a place to work. You know? Anyway, thank you for coming. So, in the interest of transparency, as you know, we're in the midst of negotiating a hire with Melissa for sustainability science, and part of that, with that, is the possibility of her husband joining the unit as well, and then also some potential across campus. And so we've invited David to come out and talk about his work and share with us what he has done and how he may fit within the different units that are interested. So I'm going to let David, he mentioned eclectic. Boy, there's a lot of different things going on, fascinating things, that I think a review of the resume, you'll get a sense, but then in talking with him, you know, suddenly we were talking about wildlife in Africa, wildlife-human interactions, boundary conditions, policy, things that really resonate with the group. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming today. And I am going to be speaking today a little bit about myself. I'll be disguising some things and trying to reveal others. And I'm going to be speaking I'm going to be speaking to a variety of audiences. So I'm going to be talking first in a more
Thank you.
A more social ecological way about some of my work, and then I'll move over to some of my older work on landscape and literary studies. And that segue is going to be kind of tough, but I know you can do it with me. And just to say, yes, I have an eclectic career. I am a South African, and I've been head of an English department. I've worked in cultural studies, interdisciplinary cultural studies, mainly on landscape. I've been in government in South Africa. I have been so many things. I've been a dean of combined humanities, including digital humanities. And I, right now, believe it or not, in my career, because of the concentration on language and on landscape and space, I've come to focus more and more and more on the way people make meaning in terms of locale, topos, and space within protected areas with actually existing landscapes, game reserves. For my sins, I am a director, have been for the past 5 years, of one of the largest field research stations in South Africa, on the edge of the Kruger National Park. It's an amazing life. Our little son runs around chasing giraffe, but all he wants in the world is a dog. So in that capacity, I've been able to engage, I suppose, an ecotone of edge effects of very, very different questions of policy, of wildlife and conservation, questions of trauma and landscape, and those sorts of things. So today, to begin, I'm going to talk about a long-term project I've had in the Kruger National Park called Under the Wire. And we'll start with the PowerPoint now, Jonathan. This is a 10-year-long research program which looks at historical aspects of water permeability in the Kruger National Park. Kruger National Park, you will remember, those of you who know, it is a very large game reserve, 350 kilometers north to south, on the border of Mozambique and Zimbabwe and South Africa. In my talk today, this doesn't seem to be working, Jonathan.
Usually you have to just bump start it on the first one.
Okay, I'll leave you to do the bump. Okay. To give you a roadmap, so it's not too confusing, I'm going to try and focus on two elements of my work. But just for the sake of convenience and thematic coherence, I'm going to talk about Savanna, Africa. I'll start with a talk on people, place, and policy, sort of edge effects in the Kruger National Park. looking at 2 projects, Under the Wire, which is an oral history project based in Kruger National Park. I'll then talk about a lot of the current work I'm doing on wildlife economies in the region, on pastoralists, on communal land systems and ecosystems, and our current involvement in very difficult processes associated with what people call the rhino wars, the massive rise in rhino poaching. I'll then, in a skillful lateral pas de deux, lateral arabesque, move to discussion of capitalism and landscape and figuration, a lot of my old work. But to make it, just so that it doesn't give you indigestion, I'll focus on, again, the world of safari, of savanna ecosystems. And I'll talk about safari tourism framing ethnicities, with a little reference to Hemingway. And then lastly, I'll conclude with some reference to my work, my past work on landscape and trauma. So that's the kind of skip and gallop we're going to be doing. And let me just begin then with the current questions I'm working on. The border ontologies. We're taking an oral history approach to the Kruger National Park, just to give you a sense of where you'll be. This is South Africa, for those of you who've lost it. And the Kruger National Park is this long, thin thing spilling into Mozambique. This is the Mozambique border. This is 350 kilometers north to south. So basically, for the moment, I'm going to be talking mainly about that area. We've been doing oral history projects here for 10 years. And what we've discovered, we're looking at migrants, we're looking at field rangers who've worked in the area for 60 or 70 years. And we're taking a transdisciplinary approach to borders, fences, and boundaries. Working out of a kind of social anthropology, cultural anthropology base and oral history, we regard fences not so much as obstacles, but as potentials, as permeable, as lived things that people have to manage and deal with, transgress. We're looking at the jurisdictional ambiguities of fences. Borders, as the geographers call them, borders as lived spaces with complex edge effects. And these are, if you want to use a metaphor derived from the language of ecosystem ecology, then what we are discovering in our oral history, just as in edge effects in ecology, you get a proliferation of things, you get interesting ambiguities, changes, complexities. What we are finding here on the edges of these game reserves, such as Kruger, we have a complexity of stories about people's lives, and especially about what one might call uncanny events. The Kruger National Park is a game reserve that is bracketed by violence. To the west, I'll go back to the map to just show you, the entire western edge has settlements of about 2 million people, many of whom were dumped there in the apartheid years, forcibly removed and put there against their will. And they tended to be collected into these apartheid compartments called homelands. So on the western edge, you have the pressure of people who had no part in the conservation project, who were not allowed into the Kruger National Park. It was a white-only game reserve until the late 80s, and people who are very poor. To the east, you have Mozambique, which in the 1980s entered into one of the most serious wars in Africa's history that resulted in 1 million people being displaced. Many of those people crossed to the Kruger National Park and resettled in South Africa. So this is a game reserve which has the pressure of complexity and trauma on 2 sides. Our oral history in looking at the borders of the Kruger National Park has come upon more and more stories about uncanny human-animal relationships. Now, for countless generations in Africa, of course, masquerade societies that do masking and performance and things, have imagined taking on the powers of wild animals. And our oral histories of the Kruger National Park have come upon more and more of these stories clustered around the edges. The powers of wild animals, societies take them on, imagine them, work through them to enable a sort of complex modeling of social personhood. Now, in places where there is considerable social ecological trauma, what you often find is that these transformative stories come to embody those contradictions. So if you want to know what people really think, what they feel, the stresses they're going through, you can also look at the stories and see what they reveal. And this is what we've been doing over 10 years, focusing especially on lions. Because lion killing The stories around lion killing, the rumors, the actual events have been very important in Africa. In colonial Africa, the extension of the colonial rail systems, colonial wildlife eradication programs, popular anxieties about new extractive labor regimes, often in people's imaginations, these were associated with a sudden burgeoning of human-lion transformations. This is the way people made sense of them. And even in cases where there were actual lion killings, the famous examples of the lions of Tsavo, people would explain those along occult lines. I'm going to tell a story of 4 places today. We're going to look down here at this area around Pabeni in the Kruger National Park. I'm going to look at this area here, Belfodent. I'm going to look over here at this little site called Xingomeni, and then another picket called Xingomeni. But also notice this, please. These are the Cabora Bassa power lines moving east to west across the Kruger National Park into Mozambique. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm just going to get on to the first of it. The first scene is a place called Pabeni. Pabeni is in the southwestern part of the Kruger National Park, and it's here that a group of black game rangers have lived and worked since the early 1920s under a sort of fraternal or even paternal relationship with the conservation authorities. They were allowed to live there, keep their families, keep cattle in the unfenced reserve under certain conditions. When the head of household died or left service of the Kruger National Park, they would be moved out. This is an amazing and complex phenomenon which existed right up until 2000, when the last of these patriarchs died. I've spent many years studying this group. Focusing on a clan called the Nkunas. And in 2000, we made a documentary film about the main patriarch, Charlie Nkuna. That's a scene from the film. But the story of this community is a story about cattle, fundamentally. And I think it might be interesting to some of you because of that. In 1939, a terrible thing happened in this area. Foot and mouth disease was detected in the region, and the veterinary authorities descended upon it and culled tens of thousands of animals throughout the region. The animals were shot and they were dumped afterwards. Now, cattle in Africa, you know, I have friends in this audience. You will know, obviously, that the anthropologists, people, even scientists, cattle are not just cattle. My friend Jean Komaroff once said about cattle that they are wet-nosed wealth, in fact. So it's a lovely term. You know, cattle are economies. They are gendered meaning, all sorts of things. So the cattle catastrophe of 1939 is something that affected many, many things. I study this with my students. We do a lot of oral history projects. And I often say to them, okay, well, here's a hill. I'll show them this slide. Tell me what you see in this scene. And they say, oh, we see an old-fashioned Land Rover. We see some game guards. And because a lot of them are scientists, you know, they'll say, oh, well, you know, you can see changing effects to the vegetation. Maybe there's a CO2 fertilization effect, more, you know, dense bushes and things. And the literary students will say, well, it's like a sort of landscape prospect in a landscape painting. And I say, but what are people standing on? And they say, a hill. But they're wrong. What they're standing on is a grave. Because in this mound are thousands and thousands of bones of cattle. When Charlie Nkuna, when we made the film about Charlie Nkuna, I took him, we stood on this hill, and he recited to me the names of all of the cows that his father owned. He remembered them from the 1930s, Blanket. I remember them still, Blanket, Les, Tangaleni, etc., etc. These were animals invested with very considerable meaning. So the Nkuna family was able to retain a sense of coherent community identity with their cattle. They could move in and out of the reserve. And with the loss of the cattle in the 1939 disaster, they were then restricted to a zone of veterinary proscription. In the early years, the Nkunas had a very good relationship with the wildlife in the area. They moved around, they saw lions, they didn't have a problem. But then in 1970, something terrible happened. One day, Charlie's daughter, Sanana, left home for school. She walked to school and vanished, disappeared. The same night, a lion attacked one of the village members. The lion was beaten off with burning brand by one of the women, extraordinary one. And it was wounded and it went away. Charlie and another Blackfield ranger started to track the lion early in the morning. And they followed the blood spoor through the panic grass. And they found something appalling. They found a bloody school uniform and the remains of a human head, which Charlie picked up, and it was, of course, the head of his daughter. But Charlie and Picket didn't leave the Kruger National Park. He remained for another 20 years, working with young white game rangers, training them, etc. So the story of this first place for them is a story about lions. It's a story about conservation. It's a story about conservation management. But what was the explanation for the changing behavior? Why did the lion attack? Charlie had two theories. First of all, the beginning of the war in Mozambique had begun to send stragglers through the Kruger National Park. Maybe he thought the lions had become accustomed to humans. Secondly, he was employed by the Kruger National Park. Villagers to the western edge may have been jealous of the patronage. So maybe the lions had been sent by someone. Maybe they weren't lions. Maybe they were avatars of some, vector of witchcraft. Charlie died last year. I didn't have the chance to ask him what he really thought. Were the lions sent from the west, from the east? Site number 2. I want to talk about a man named Wilson's Masia. He was a master tracker at a very expensive game lodge in South Africa, but he'd been one of tens of thousands of Mozambicans who'd left the country, leaving their possessions behind, bodies of their relatives mutilated, a terrible war, across the Kruger National Park. And this was the first of many illegal crossings Wilson made. He subsequently went back to guide people across the Kruger National Park. But then he became a game ranger, based for a while at the Xingomeni Picket. It's the one far in the north on the eastern boundary, patrolling the eastern boundary with Mozambique. And it's here that he had an extraordinary thing happen to him. He and his fellow rangers one day, first arriving at the picket, found in the bush bones, old bones scattered, and some remnant graves. They didn't know what this was about. Could these have been people who had been killed in some forced removal? Were they Mozambican refugees? What was this? Perhaps it was the remnant of an older apartheid forced removal. That night, the rangers found themselves surrounded by lions. They didn't know why. The lions seemed unafraid. And they started to draw a connection between this old history and the presence of lions. They tried to get rid of them. And then, as Wilson said to me, I finally realized what it was. These were not lions, these were abapanzi, to use the Zulu word, or amadlozi, those who live below. They were ancestors. These were not lions, these were people. These were the spirits of those who'd been, so traumatized in the past, who their spirits unpropitiated. He then took some snuff, said a few words, and said, I'm sorry, we are not from this place. We are here for research, but we apologize for you. And the lions moved off. He said, that's what he said. But in this story, I think there's an interesting piece of evidence about how social science works. The edge effects of these areas, this is between boundaries. It's a complex area. In the social sciences, complex determination is often called overdetermination, right? Multiple events being an event explained by multiple causes. This place, Xingomeni, is very close to this place, Cabora, Bassa. The power lines that move across South Africa to the Mozambican hydroelectric project way in the north of Mozambique. In order to make it across Kruger, a lot of the stragglers walk through this area, sticking to this pathway. And lions in the area have started to specialize in killing them. So Xingomeni is near Cabora, Bassa. This is a friend of mine who's doing a leopard demography project and took these images. Every night at 9:06, the camera track records a big lion moving west to east. It patrols the border. One day, it's not the actual image I didn't want to show you, but I mean, one night, the lion triggered the camera, and 10 minutes later, the camera was triggered by a group of people walking from east to west, and for the first time, the lion turns around in the next camera image. And we don't know what happened. We don't know what it is. But Xingomeni is close to Cabora, Bassa. And so it's obvious also that one of the determinations is changing behavior by lions that have learned what humans are. There's another story about that, which we can tell later, perhaps, in the listeners. Okay, moving ahead, I want to just very briefly talk about gender and violence and landscape. Constance, oops, I nearly gave you her name, lives in a village on the edge of Kruger. She's originally from Mozambique. We interviewed her extensively. National Geographic was doing a special series of short sequences on my research in Kruger, and we did the interviews as part of this. She crossed to South Africa in 2008. She walked across Kruger 4 times. Constance's story is a story of terrible gender violence. In fact, let me see if I've got the actual quotation for you. This is the typical sort of transcription of an oral history project. Just focus on, you'll see the references to the way people use muti or traditional medicines when they walk and move to try and protect themselves. The Machanga, the word for the sort of right-wing guerrilla forces in Mozambique opposed to the Mozambican revolution. Machanga killed a lot of people, says Constance. If they found a boy, they hate boys because they thought they would fight against them. So they would shoot the boys and cut their throats and put their heads on a pole. The girls, they would just sling them in half vertically. It's a terrible image, but it does reveal the kinds of trauma that, that Constance was going through. She left her home, she went to South Africa, and then, like many people in South Africa today, she became subject to 2 major contradictions. The one was a sort of document problem. She was undocumented. Her child who'd been born in South Africa was not able to get into school. She could only get those documents by going back to Mozambique. But she couldn't go back through the border because she would have had to bribe people and she didn't have the money. So she decided to walk through the Kruger Park again. But at the same time, she'd been beset by another issue, and that was witchcraft accusations against her, because in South Africa, a newly modernizing state like Eastern Europe, modernizing, trying to be a state, but, beset by problems, as people see it, of immigration, there's tremendous xenophobia. So Constance was accused of being a witch. No one would help her. Her father was a Nyanga, a witch doctor in Mozambique. She wanted to go and see him. The only solution was to eschew the company of men, to walk alone. And that's what she did. And she said, the only thing scaring me is the lions. What I'm going to do is when I'll walk with my 2 kids. 2 of them will walk with me. And the 3rd one, every night we're going to tie her into a tree to keep her safe. So that's the sort of 3rd scene. The final scene I want to just mention is about lions, borders, and witchcraft concerns. Has to do with Kruger Park officials, and particularly this man, a friend of mine, Stephen Mincy. This is when we're making one of the documentary films. Steve Mincy, very charismatic. He's got sort of dreads. He loves lions. He works on therianthropy, lion human transformations, as a private kind of research project. He's fascinated with the lion men phenomena in East Africa. Stephen is a frontline ranger who works on the western edge of Kruger, dealing with communities. He works with 20 different communities, all forms sorts of nested authority, traditional authority, conservation authorities. And he was working on a lion demography project as well, and became obsessed with this one lion that he called Kandanga, or warrior, that would exit to Kruger Park and come back. And this lion had managed the permeability of the border in amazing ways. It would leave, it would come back, it would kill cattle. It was getting huge, until finally one day they managed to capture it and shoot it. But this lion, as it moved, tracked a series of contradictions. And Stephen said to me at the end of our interviews, you have to understand, I said, but the story about lions is an old story. He said, no, it's not an old story at all. It's not an old story. What it is, you say it's old news, okay? I say no. It is old in a way, we know about it, but I don't think anybody can come and claim that they know all about lions unless they've followed the lion tracks all the way until the end. This has been what my research has been obsessed with, is following these stories, following these projects, until inevitably you find lion tracks overlapped with human. You find history emerging from landscape. That's what my projects have been about. And that's what my project with Stephen was about as well. Stephen believed in the end that the lion had started to use anti-tracking ruses like poachers. Okay, just very briefly, I want to talk about current work, just flip through a few issues that we are currently engaged with in the research base where Melissa and I live. in South Africa. And most particularly, I want to talk about the wildlife economy in this wider region, the Kruger National Park and other allied parks in the greater transfrontier conservation area across these countries. The Kruger National Park itself is a huge part of the wildlife economy. There are 1.7 million people who move as tourists through this area. And they have a difficult history. They were a very racialized institution at first. In the 1990s, after apartheid, they developed one of the world's most interesting strategic adaptive management programs. And they're trying to work right now on moving from a sort of benefits-based logic where people would come in, they would allow them to come and collect catching grass, to perhaps structures of co-management, a more rights-based logic. The other thing they've had to do is work with pastoralists to overcome all those historical traumas that I spoke about. And they've actually reached an amazing conclusion. They're going to go back 20 years in archival detail and reimburse people who've lost cattle to lions coming out of the Kruger National Park. And they say that is the only way forward at this stage, because trauma is lodged so particularly in cattle and damage-causing animal loss that this is what they have to do. So Kruger moved out of its former ecology base. I want to just mention one of the problems of economies that have to do with what one might call the balkanization or landscape fragmentation of this area. And I want to talk especially about a little reserve named Royal Malawan. If you stay at Royal Malawan, if you're Bono or Elton John, you can afford it. It's $4,000 to $5,000 a night a person. That's the economy you're dealing with, right? I once was allowed to have breakfast there when I was doing some filming. The problem with Royal Malawan is it's a closed reserve. It's right on the edge of the game reserve where Melissa and I stay. In fact, just before I flew back here, a 12 elephant broke through our electric fence from Royal Malawan and were interrupting the student research projects on our base. But anyway. So the problem with Royal Malawan is it epitomizes an economy problem and a problem of management that I think is really instructive. In order to deliver that kind of value, you have to guarantee sightings of big game. To do that, you have to, probably to be fenced in is a good idea, right? But the other problem with being fenced in is you tend to have too many elephants and too many lions. So your conservation management program has to then intervene, and you put the elephants on porcine vaccine and the lions, and you stop them breeding. Now you have a tourism problem, because tourists want to see babies. They want to see calves, they want to see cubs. So this balance is part of the conservation management dilemma in these parts of South Africa. And it's one thing we've been looking at quite closely. Also, you have to maintain a really complicated, and this is a landscape issue, a sort of closed openness. All of these game reserves, if you drive around as a tourist, the guides won't take you near the fence. If they do, if you see the fence, they get fired because they don't want the visible frame to be revealed. So that's another part of the economy. The biggest part, perhaps, is the attempt to integrate the rural poor into the booming game ranching industry in South Africa. South Africa is now the world's center of safari hunting. With changes in East Africa, a lot of it has been driven to South Africa. It's certainly the world center of wildlife breeding. There are 9,000 game farms in South Africa. Approximately 16.8% of the land surface is devoted to this practice. Right? And the profits are monumental, massive, particularly from the breeding of rare color morphs like this for safari hunters, especially American, and large horned animals, the mythical 55-inch horned buffalo. But this is a booming industry. It reminds me of tulip mania in the Dutch world. Massive profits. And the government in South Africa, my government, the government I've worked with, is trying to bring rural communities 90%, 70% unemployment into this industry. But it is a particular problem. So we are focusing on that right now. One of the ways they're doing it also is to try and persuade the communities who live here to give up their communal lands to game reserves, have them incorporated. And it's in this sort of instance that I really am thrilled to be coming to this institution, to Colorado, to have remarkable remote sensors, to have people who understand what I'm talking about when I speak about cattle as more than simply the bovine. And then to have people who work in a critical way on ecosystem services. because consultants working with ecosystem services, using data from remote sensing, using LiDAR, using high-resolution satellite imagery, come to conclusions about land use which are category-based. They say all of these areas here are degraded, they have no value, and they are then worthy of being included into game reserves. In fact, all of our research, which is social sciences working with ecologists, suggests the opposite. These are areas where people are collecting mopani caterpillars, insect protein, thatching grass, 3 tons of wood per household per year. There's massive provisioning services provided that are invisible at a certain level and that are left out of these arguments. And so one of the critical things that we want to encourage in all of our interdisciplinary dealings, and I really hope to be working with some of you on that, is providing arguments about the invisible economies of these places, working with GIS and remote sensing. Okay, the last thing I wanted to say in this section was that we are also heavily involved in what might be called the study of death economies. The dark obverse of the wildlife economy. It's changed my life. I mean, I used to be able to walk in the field in the Kruger National Park, casually carrying a rifle with Melissa's students on OTS, and it's not possible anymore. We have, I suppose, very catastrophically for Kruger, funded by Howard Buffett and others, massive militarization of the Kruger National Park, anti-poaching programs. We're losing rhino at a rate, you can see the sort of figures there. In 2014, 1,215 a year in South Africa. South Africa is the last remaining habitat for white rhino in the wild. And at the current rate, death is going to exceed the breeding rates this year. So these are serious issues, but it's affecting everything. It also relates to rhino horn as an inelastic commodity in technical and economic terms, a commodity that people will pay anything for. And what is badly understood is its relation to global prestige networks, emerging class positions in Asia, especially Vietnam and China, but also increasingly in corruption from North Korea. Emerging elites using rhino horn and the consumption of rhino horn as conspicuous consumption, signaling class positions, etc. In the face of all this horror, people are coming up with desperate measures, flying drones over the area, poisoning rhino horn, dehorning rhinos, or otherwise saying, shoot the poachers. We must have a kill on sight policy, which the Kruger National Park has resisted, because the Kruger National Park knows this is a complex problem. And we are studying this complex problem. This is some sort of propaganda in China by an NGO. I think it's unfortunate. This is a funeral of a poacher, a small-time person who was sort of guiding another larger poacher through the Kruger National Park, who was shot and is now being buried in a shallow grave in Mozambique. So right now we're at a tipping point and we're studying it. My own role, my sort of social ecological studies produce materials which are sometimes, I think, maybe of interest to some of you here in the room. Melissa and I and a huge team are working right now on a paper, these people here, on the wildlife economy. I have a book on Kruger, which I have to have out. We have a couple of films. I work a lot on interpretive. I wrote the new plan for interpretive services in the whole of South African national parks. So I'm very interested in the kind of writing into science and policy that I know a number of you are interested in, and this university is very good at. We have extensive networks, 300 traditional healers working with us on protocols for collecting plant materials in protected areas. And then a series of courses which we could talk about at some stage, maybe in our discussions this afternoon in departments. So that's really the sort of social ecological hat. And I have to say, I cannot think of a better place to be doing these eccentric things than CSU. So I'm not going to move to something very different. And I'm going to talk about some of my past work in landscape. And sort of crude way of putting it would be, what can Downton Abbey tell us about game reserves? So this is a difficult segue, I suppose. I'll be talking a little bit about the genealogy of capitalism's consumption of nature, but especially talking about what I would call the rise of 1930s safari modernism. This leads out of an argument I often make for senior undergraduate courses. It draws a lot from cultural anthropology, but also ecology. So I spent a long time talking about, by the way, anyone know what this is? It's a line there in front of Downton Abbey, Highclere Castle, that it's called. It looks like a fence. It's actually a ha-ha. Anyone know what a ha-ha is?
Yes.
Tell me.
They used to have hermits live or, yeah, hermits living there.
Yeah, picturesque, picturesque hermits, or also the actual architecture there. The ha-ha is a way of preventing sheep from coming too near the castle, so you can have a view of distant picturesque sheep, but it's an invisible barrier, right? You see it in Jane Austen, all over. But yeah, so what can it tell us about game reserves? Well, first of all, you have to understand, and this is going to be really fast. I spent a lot of time talking about subjectivity, the rise of liberal economics in England, free trade in the 18th century, the literature's sentiment, elegy, poetry about wandering, etc. But it's also always about landscape, and it's about this idiom, an idiom which was imported to England and used in English liberal landscape estates. This is called the Claudian perspective. Claude Lorraine, bracketing wind screens, distant ruins, etc. All over England, liberal landowners, liberal in the political sense of the Whig Party, would remake their landscapes in the image of Claude paintings, because those paintings figured a way of providing a metaphor for liberal good judgment. Raised up on a prospect, the man or woman of liberal sensibility looks down and meditates on the landscape. Typically, when these idioms, well, first of all, there was a lot of violence underlying this, because it does tie into a change in the agricultural mode of production, including enclosures, all the vanishing commonage that these places were eating up. And the landscape paintings themselves became a way of naturalizing that violence. As it naturalized the violence in landscape painting and landscape architecture, so too it developed a kind of dialectical nostalgia for past types, the pre-industrial cottagers, peasants, banditti, and hermits, right, okay. And in the later versions of British landscape painting, this is one by the famous painter Constable, using the Claudian template, distant, light saturated horizon, bracketing wind screens, and a tiny figure here, enlarged slightly there, a gypsy woman who's camping out. So the landscape produces these memories, this nostalgia for rural types all over the place. When this idiom is exported, you get different types. Here is capitalism. This is Asher Brown, one of the Hudson Valley Luminists, famous painter in America. The Advance of Civilization, 1853. And as the woods are cleared and the smokestacks start to appear, so you have in the dark, what John Barrell calls the dark side of the landscape, types, Native Americans, sitting there, sort of caryatid, statuesque, waiting while the next phase of capitalism accelerates into the future. They are bracketed off, stranded, as it were, on the margins. Now, these are global idioms. They're imported everywhere, but especially to sector environments, Australia, etc. Okay, now I have to make a big jump. What does this have to do with game reserves? Well, give me a moment. In an epochal shift from the mid-19th century to World War I, of course, there was a new critique of industrial capitalism. These are two examples. Eliot, Unreal City, Under the Brown Fog of a Winter Dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not known, I had not thought death had undone so many. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, hundreds of works. Marx, labor is external to the worker, it does not belong to his nature, etc. It mortifies his flesh and ruins his spirit. Marx's theory of alienation. So industrial capitalism is coming in for these sorts of criticism that have to do with anime, and the feeling of the dulling of the senses associated with the newly urban environment. It's now that the word trauma starts to be applied not just to an open wound, but to internal conditions as well in the immediate post-First World War period. To a feeling that also that you are somehow stranded. Heidegger called it a Gestell, the feeling of being in a frame, not knowing what the frame was, of being totally stranded. So for Europeans, there's several paths to therapeutic recovery from this condition. One of them is to do the sort of fascist trick and say, you know, we are being, industry is killing us, immigrants are killing us, we need to build walls against us and make ourselves into pure beings. Pure without pollution. That's the Italian fascist. That's the Mussolini solution and German solution as well. But the other solution is to travel to Africa. Which Lawrence says in Women in Love, talking about African statues, her face was crushed tiny like a beetle, etc. She knew what he himself did not know. It must have been thousands of years since the race had died mystically. That is, since the relationship between the sense and the outspoken mind had broken, leaving the experience all in one sort, mystically sensual. What the hell does that mean? Well, Lawrence. Anyway, Lawrence, Lawrence is looking for sort of thinking through the body idiom that he can parasitize for this therapeutic effect. And of course, the whole of Cubism plays with this, using the African masking traditions to explore this idea of being in the body, of thinking in the body, and recovering sensory experience. And this idea is then moved into African safari. Of course, Conrad has changed the way we think about Africa by 1900. The idea of Africa as a therapeutic alternative to metropolitan alienation is seized upon by all the advocates of strenuous masculinity. Teddy Roosevelt, Baden-Powell, Boy Scouts, all of them. And as Donna Haraway has shown, Teddy Roosevelt is really interesting. This is expedition. They shot 12,000 animals for the Smithsonian. There's a fascinating connection that I've worked on, Donna Haraway has too, a circuit between safari, hunting and American museum displays, the emergence of the diorama, the habitat group diorama in places like the Field Museum in Chicago and elsewhere. But the thing is that, going to Africa is not just going to Africa, it's going back in time to earlier types. The same types, if you like, that were bracketed off in those landscapes we saw earlier. If you go to the Field Museum in Chicago, before you get to the Africa Hall, you have to pass through an area where there are statues of live Nandi warriors spearing lions, an archetype absolutely for the type of muscular and strenuous being that was perceived by Roosevelt and others to be lost in America and in Europe, etc. So there's an increasing fascination with this idea of Africa as a kind of prosthetic body. This is one of my favorite examples. It's from 1926, and it's a poster from the Illustrated London News, like why you should go to South Africa to look at animals, right? And I don't know if you can pick it up, but here's the sort of game scout. He's the kind of body, I'm telling you now what's going on in Africa, listen to me, instinctual. Then there's a sort of transitional figure, probably a colonial type. And then these timorous little British tourists who are standing there with their moustaches quivering, who are being introduced to the game by this combination of figures. Down here, there's a bit of racism about South African Boers or Afrikaners. The British just think of them as stupid, so this guy isn't even looking at nature. But anyway. Now, this model of kind of sentinel African figures starts to proliferate around the world. In South Africa, it's associated also with a fascination with picturesque, fetishistically loyal, almost feudal labor, this type of character, the Zulu, the Shangaan. In East Africa, it's closely associated with figures like Maasai, Samburu, all of those kinds of people. And in the birth, and in this process, what we have, beginning in the 1930s and then proliferating across the world, and still to this day, something that I would call safari modernism. It depends on that mobilization of the black body, but also stalls and stops in Roosevelt's Africa from 1900 to 1930. And its idiom is khaki, canvas, kerosene lighting, campaign furniture, and trackers, almost always black, who sit on the front of the Land Rover while you move through the environment. So the persistence of this safari modernist idiom is a major issue. It's a major problem, even. It's a problem of employment for black people in many of these worlds. It's hard to get a job if you don't have a high school, if you don't have more than a high school education, outside of the guiding industry in tourism given these safari modernist conditions. There's a pressure. It's like a wind blowing on you all the time, you know, to be the black body in this environment. It's a strong feature of tourism at the moment, of global tourism, which is being exaggerated and exacerbated by a lot of the new areas of focus for neoliberal tourism. You know, making yourself into an ethnically picturesque subject, etc. There's been a lot written about that in anthropology. So these are some of the subjects, some of the contexts that I've been working on, and then exported globally through Epcot. I love this. The sort of the mushiness of first of all, there's the old vehicle. You know, we're harking back to the past, and then the road itself, which is carefully, you know, concreted form of a muddy road. So these are some of the contexts of that I evoke very often when I speak about Africa and safari modernism, about conservation, time, and the black body especially. I want to just conclude by talking about East Africa a little bit now, and a short story by Ernest Hemingway, which I thought of forcing all of you to read before you came up with this. No chance of that. Just having you here is so thrilling for 7 minutes or 10 minutes more. I wouldn't do that to you. So I'm going to take a couple of excerpts. First of all, there's a weird epigraph to the story. Do you remember Hemingway, right? Okay. Hemingway goes to Africa a couple of times, becomes famous and imitated as a big game hunter, as an example of strenuous masculinity. He visited East Africa. He worked with some of the major, very famous, romantically realized so-called white hunters, the people who you see if you watch the film Out of Africa. And Hemingway writes Snows of Kilimanjaro, and at the start, this is what it says. Kilimanjaro is a snow-covered mountain, 19,000 feet high, said to be the highest mountain in Africa. Its western summit is called the Maasai House of God. Yeah, sick. Close to the western summit, there is a dried and frozen carcass of a leopard. No one has explained what the leopard was seeking at that altitude. This is in italics as an epigraph at the start of the story. The story is about, in the film, I think that's Gregory Peck, isn't it? I can't remember. The story of Harry, who has got gangrene, kind of displaced castration, I suppose. His leg is rotting, he's dying. And the story, it's actually a really fine story in many ways. It's about gender and about violence and about what is real to you as you die. And Harry's struggle to stop re-invoking the violence of arguments between himself and his wife at the time. But it's about Africa, because Harry is also a writer who's come back to Africa to try and regain creativity. Like a boxer running at high altitude, he says, for a writer, you've got to go to Africa. We should all remember that when we have writer's block, I suppose. But anyway. Okay. As he's dying, well, there's this amazing moment which I will camp up a little bit. He hears a hyena. Melissa and I love hyenas. We think they're amazing animals. Hemingway didn't. He hears a hyena far off, and the hyena is tracking Harry. It's a kind of death figure, spectral figure. He says to his wife, the only thing I've never lost is curiosity. She says, you've never lost anything. You're the most complete man I've ever known. What? Christ, he says. How little a woman knows. What is that? Your intuition? Because, and that, I think, is this beautiful moment in Hemingway. A sentence with a subject and a predicate. Because, the word because implies a sentence earlier, a cause. Because he says this awful thing, right? Because of the hyena, because death had rested its head on the cot. So he reinvokes this violence, which is the norm, as a defense against the fear of death. It's a very interesting moment in the story. And then the hyena moves up, and in his head, it's this death presence which moves in on him and waits on his chest. And he could not move or speak. He heard the woman say, Bwana is asleep. Take the cot very gently, carry it into the tent. He could not speak to her to make it go away. It crouched now heavier, so he could not breathe. And then while they lifted the cot, suddenly it was all right. And the weight went from his chest. You know the story. And the next line is, it was morning. I'd been mourning for some time, and he heard the plane. And he's put in the plane. And we think to ourselves, what the hell is going on? Because he, in the previous scene, the only reading possible of that is that he's died. And now he's on the plane. So let's pursue this to its logical conclusion. The pilot arrives, he's an old-fashioned guy in a tweed jacket, and they have this banter. What's the matter, old cock? Bad leg. Short male sentence. Will you have some breakfast? Thanks. Have some tea. It's the puss moth type of aircraft. I won't be able to take the Mem Saab. Only room for one. Only the two boys, right? But the Mem Saab reference is interesting because, of course, it ties us to a colonial world of South Asia, of old colonial. Now, if we take the view, as I do, that this is Harry's death fantasy, right? Taking off on the plane, leaving women behind for this moment, with a sort of retrograde movement back in time to a world which is more feudal, which is more comfortable for him. These are the processes that are so often involved in safari modernism, and they often have to do with Africans and race. And what happens at the end is, I don't give you we don't have time to do all of it. The plane takes off, and there's the beautiful perspectival effects. I've collapsed it a lot, but all of these additives, these conjunctions, a little bit of scattering and the movement had no gallop as far as you could see. And then instead of going to Arusha, they turned and then they're going to climb, and the pilot smiles and points. And ahead, this is Harry, he could see as wide as all the world, great, high, and unbelievably white in the sun, was the square top of Kilimanjaro. And then he knew that that was where he was going. Now, okay, I've talked a long time, and I'm just about done, about the rise of safari modernism, its treatment of time, etc. The romantic reciprocity, the sort of class-determined one in England between subjects and landscapes, in elegy, for instance. When you write Gray's elegy, you're talking about a community of mourners. For the white settler body in Africa, there's no such guarantee of mourning, of a place, of people who will mourn you. For this reason, many colonial administrators and many writers resorted to the fantasy of being able to use a kind of prosthetic landscape position to achieve prosthetic conditions of mourning, to solve these sorts of complexities. There are three graves. This is a grave of Dennis Finch Hatton. If you read Isaac Denison's Coram Blixen's Out of Africa, you'll know about that. This is the grave of Cecil John Rhodes on the Matopas Hill. And this is where Stevenson Hamilton, the first director of the Kruger National Park, wanted to be buried because he believed that if he was there, the poachers would have a fetishistic understanding that they shouldn't poach. Cecil John Rhodes, similar sort of view. So we have these architectures over and over again. And all of them have the same kind of additional fantasy. And that is that even if the local politicians don't come to support us, lions will. They'll come and lie on the grave. Maasai warriors will come and stand there of their own volition. But always older, picturesque types, not current political. So I spent a lot of time talking about the rise of safari modernism. And I want to just end by saying, the work I've done on landscape, interdisciplinary work on landscape, very often helps me to understand game reserves and to understand literature, I hope. But, fundamentally, one of the effects of landscape, Raymond Williams once said, you can never be a working person and be in a landscape. The landscape is a perspective that's organized for a particular kind of viewership. Landscape has to do with hegemony, political power, dominance. So one of the ways in which I've found the landscape idiom useful, I'm just blocking out the camera here, I realize. We're going to have very close, intimate views of one. So, one of the ways in which I've tried to work with landscape is in relation to the courses I've taught on trauma. And a lot of it has to do with my role as a South African activist. I lived in a world, being on the left and in South Africa and working in political movements, working in the political underground, where not even my parents believed that people were being tortured and killed and dying, even when it was people I knew, even when I had some very difficult experiences myself. There was no public archive. In a way, it was like living in someone else's landscape. Things would pass out of the everyday, they would pass out of the press. You know that someone had disappeared, but there would be no public archiving of it. Now, a lot of people have worked with this notion of landscape to try and explain that. A lot of painters and writers and people working on the Holocaust experience have worked with these ideas of landscape and memory and memorial, trying to find an idiom. And in the, after apartheid, I work a lot in different modes. One of them is in art history and in exhibition. I did an exhibition that traveled the United States called Displacement, which was about violence and landscape. I commissioned an artist, probably one of the 5 most famous artists in the world today, William Kentridge, to do a series of meditations on violence in South Africa in the immediate post-1994 period. And William chose to make the work 7 minutes. I wasn't able to, we can't watch it now, but I would encourage you to. In which he takes autopsy photographs and works with them. Kentridge works in large-scale charcoal drawing. And he uses a Bolex camera, takes 4 frames, steps back to the drawing, erases it, modifies it. So in the drawings, you can see the trace of the previous event. And this next sequence is just one of the millions of shots from a work which we commissioned in 1994 called Felix in Exile, in which a body collapses, bleeds, you get these autopsy marks on it, and then gradually you have all these papers fluttering down, and eventually it changes into a series of hills in the landscape. For William, that was a way of meditating on some of the stuff that I'm also interested in. So that's a skip and a gallop over what I've been doing. We don't have time to do this now. I'm interested in many things. You know, I've had some remarkable conversations this morning already. I can't think of a better place than this to work on many of these issues, on issues of movement and people and cattle, thinking in and out of landscape. I'm very grateful to you for attending to me and spending so much time on this eclectic pas de deux. So thank you so much. Yeah, Michael.
I've got a very practical question for you, which is the students you take from NC State to Africa, is there anything you do, and this is really a question for both of you, I suppose, to sort of disabuse them of the idea that they're traveling back in time?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Melissa can answer that with me. I think that's a really good point. One of the ways in which it can be done, and I would recommend it for study abroad here, is to have a kind of bracketing course or an initial course that you would do on the subject you come. But we do teach some of these subjects, and we also have, Safari modernism is what they are embedded in immediately. We have Black South Africans who are part of the teaching team and things like that, which does help. But I think just the density of the social ecological material we work on, and the fact that a lot of the bases we work at are run not by ourselves, but by local Africans, especially the base in the north. And the students themselves are taught and guided and moved around in these environments by people like that. I think that is instructive. But that is a constant, I look at a lot of other American study abroad programs, and they really are like spring break in Africa. And the other very important thing with Melissa's program and with some of the ones I've run is recurrence. In anthropology, you don't have a decent case study. You don't have a field study unless you really go back over years. And I think returning all the time and gathering knowledge and data and feeding it back into a generalized data bank is critical to that more nuanced and complex understanding too. But that is a constant concern. Yep.
Have you thought at all about how the findings of this diverse work parallel what's going on with the US-Mexico border and those sort of spaces and the meanings of what's the politics today? Have you thought?
They are paralleled in many respects, and I am interested in those comparative studies. I'm also interested in the militarization of conservation across the world, especially in places like Guatemala and things like that, where the military protects the extension of protected areas for particular reasons, namely to keep guerrilla forces out and things like that. So yeah, I think what we would try and do is introduce always. I've learned everything from ecology. I think in recent years, complex systems, complex adaptive systems. Seeing those kinds of things working their way through history is really, I think, the clues that's a clue to leading to good comparative studies and to the kinds of problems that Michael was alluding to. Yes, of course, even the way the fence and the border is lived, let alone the sort of Trumpisms about building the wall and things like that. But yeah, and other areas. Yeah. Other questions? I'm going to, yes.
Just one more. In Safari modernism, there seems to be a striking absence of Black women.
Yeah.
It's just like an invisible, kind of a huge absence. And it seems to me that's still going on in Safari discourse. And this is like a question observation, but it seemed that your oral history project was trying to include them, put them back in.
Yeah, that is true. In terms of representations, women are highly underrepresented in that kind of environment. They tend to still be within a domestic sphere. There's a very, very difficult set of engagements that one also has to have. And I'm looking forward to having discussions with some of you about it here, around pastoralism. Because, people tend to think as pastoralists as men. You keep cattle on men. And there's a kind of gender division within Africa. But that is, more and more in the communities we engage with, women are also cattle keepers. But the sort of nexus of relationships between old men, customary authority, and cattle versus women in the fields is the thing that you have to negotiate all the time. So there are parallels there, and I think many of the anthropologists who work in these fields are aware of that. Also, the very particular and complex role that women have to do with food security. A lot of the women collecting from communal lands are collecting as a buffer against household shock in times of crisis. So I think you want to raise up that labor into visibility in order to make things more complex.
This is a little bit vague, but I'm a wildlife biology major, so I'm interested kind of in like the populations of these animals and the habitat components. I guess I was just wondering if that's something that you looked at like throughout this whole thing. I know it's very vague, but
no, you want to add, sorry, I did not catch you.
Oh no,
okay. Yeah, no, we're very interested in that. But I work. Maybe I can answer that with a story. That the main one of the two really well-known lion demography people who work in that area. Paul Funston, and whose work you probably know, and then a guy named Sam Ferreira, who's one of the lead scientists in the South African National Parks. Working as a sort of anthropologist on these issues, I was very interested in demography, landscape, fragmentation, edge effects, complexity, the relationship between biodiversity and resilience, all of these things, habitat, and I was also teaching for the Organization of Tropical Studies. I taught one of their core programs for 10 years. So I had to speak about those things to people who were, wildlife biology people. But still, every paper I gave, Sam would sit in the back, Sam Ferreira, and he would just go, year after year. Or, And then I realized, okay, I have no graphs. So, but recently, I think one of the world's great Savanna biology program network meetings in South Africa, Kruger National Park. Sam Ferreira came up to me and he said, okay, he gave me a kiss. Which is amazing from one of the sort of most butch wildlife biologists in the world. But he and I do share a lot of interest in demography, but also the sort of the relationship between habitat, fragmentation, and human populations. That's always what I would add. Sam Ferreira did a really amazing. I can't say this.
go for it, but you're running out of time.
Sorry. Sam Ferreira did a really significant experiment recently, about 5 years ago. We went out to the area. They call up lions using the noise of a wounded buffalo calf, and then they dart in the column. He played near the Cabora Bassa power lines the sound of people talking, and they brought the lions in that way.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much.
We have lunch. downstairs. We have 2 hours walk. Yes, lunch is provided.
Then you want to go.
And then more around 2-ish, quarter to.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, and no shake your hand.
No, that's cool.
And we'll have a great day.
I'll get to talk to you.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested.
Absolutely. I mean, I just.
Yeah.
The other side of the shell where I've been, you know,
I like to, I think you were reporting on campus distance.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, let's talk for a second about it.
Okay, we'll be around.
I have a conflict. I don't know.
Yeah, I think yeah,
Probably after talking here a little.
Yeah.
Things are coming all this way.
So did you come from
well, I flew from South Africa a little while
There.
ago, so
How you doing?
it's
It's good, our kids are
and then,
linked up.
I know they're on a team.
I'm so excited. Yeah, you know, it's really happy to
Yeah.
get that.
Oh, good.
we should talk about place.
Hi.
Lovely talk.
Thank you.
I listened to it online.
Oh,
So.
good. I'm afraid you've got a lot of my button being filmed, but I'll meet you down there.
Hi, you know, I have to say, your work is like the poster child of this PhD program we're proposing.